Yeah.
I always say there's very little future in predicting the future, and it's probably one of the reasons that conventional planning has really fallen out of favor. Strict alignment actually increases the fragility of the organization.
Mhm.
It may be capable of fitting very well. I mean, the whole concept of strategic fit, it may be capable of fitting to one set of environmental conditions, but not to adapt as the environment adapts. Wisdom is the ability to change your mind when new evidence presents itself. And I think obviously the challenge here is ego.
Welcome to Strategy Meets Reality podcast. I'm your host, Mike Jones, and today I'm joined by Norman Chorn, strategist, educator, and a leading voice in scenario thinking. We explore why alignment can make organisation fragile, how to build coherence through common capabilities, and why preparing for multiple futures is essential for resilience. This is a practical conversation about designing organisations that can adapt, absorb, and thrive. Welcome back to Strategy Meets Reality podcast. I'm your host, Mike Jones, and today I'm glad to be joined by Norman Chorn, who we've had loads of interaction with over social media, so it's great to actually have you as a guest, Norman. How are you?
Pretty good, thanks, Mike. Yeah, nice to see you again.
Yeah, good. Just for our listeners, do you mind giving us a bit of a background about yourself and a bit of context what you've been up to lately?
Sure. Yeah, so I have a sort of a portfolio thing that I do at the moment. I consult, I run a small consulting business, I teach at a number of universities around the place, and I like writing and researching. Very similar to you, Mike.
Yeah. What do you mainly teach at the universities?
I run a program on strategy and uncertainty, and in particular on scenario planning. So, in fact, I'm heading over to South Africa in a couple of weeks' time to run their elective on the MBA program. And in the last while, I've been traveling pretty extensively through Southeast Asia, been working with a lot of multinationals. I'm sure you'll understand are pretty much on a state of continuous alert with this global uncertainty at the moment. So we're trying to do quite a bit of figuring out there. It's been very interesting.
Yeah, I think definitely with what's been going on, just like COVID did, really brought to the forefront around the need to understand uncertainty, to understand the utility of scenario planning, which is, yeah. Sorry, you wanna?
No. Yeah,
No,
right.
yeah. I'm just saying, which would really bring forward actually an interesting question to start with, which is why do we find it so difficult to understand what the future holds?
Yeah, I might just start by perhaps commenting on why people are interested in doing it in the first place. And
Yeah, sounds cool.
I think one of the things that we've been encountering has been this concern for resilience in organizations, the ability to kind of survive and continue thriving. And, in a lot of ways, that really means you've got to be prepared for a range of different conditions and be prepared to operate effectively in each of them. So in a sense, then, understanding the future has been quite important because you want to know what's going to happen next year or indeed even next month sometimes. And so there's been this enormous interest in knowing what is it we need to prepare ourselves for in order to remain viable and therefore resilient in our marketplace. So I guess the challenge has been, Mike, that people find it very difficult to get a grip on the future. I mean, and there are a number of reasons for it. One of them is that the future doesn't actually exist at any point in time. It's not as if it's kind of waiting for you at the end of the garden gate and you've just got to get there and you encounter it. If you look at our market, our environment, it's really a system. And like any system, it's made up of a series of elements, and there are many elements in it, and each one of these elements really operates kind of independently. You've got customers, you've got regulators, you've got competitors, you've got technology, you've even got consultants who generally come in and confuse things as well. But in essence, yeah, and that happens a lot. But in essence, what happens, like any system, it's subject to entropy, to break down. So these elements and the connections between them break down, and what happens is that the rearranging of the elements on an ongoing basis causes the future or the current present to change. So really, rather than standing at a point in time, staring at your garden gate and wondering when I get to that gate I'll be in the future, you've actually got multiple garden gates you face because,
Mm.
in a sense, there is no one future, there are just multiple futures. And that, of course, introduces the whole question about, why scenario planning, which is really about, or it's actually more accurately termed scenario thinking, which is why, I want us to start thinking about multiple futures and stop trying to predict them.
Yeah.
I always say there's very little future in predicting the future. And it's probably one of the reasons that, conventional planning has really fallen out of favor because, by the time you've dotted the I's and crossed the T's and the ink is dry and you go out into the field, I think it was you that said no marketing plan or no strategy plan ever survives the meeting with its first customer. Things have changed. So
Yeah,
just
yeah,
being prepared for one future doesn't really make a lot of sense.
yeah. And I think that's right. And we look, we have a term saying the plan is nothing, planning is everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the conversation that you're having all the
Mm.
time. And not only is it everything, but it's ever present because in a sense, you've got to be doing the planning or the learning all the time. And that's really what modern planning is in today's context. It's about continuously probing, trying something, getting feedback, learning from it, adapting, adjusting, and, going around in this continuous circles. Gone are the days of the annual kind of planning meeting or strategy meeting. The trick used to be this is a really important strategy meeting, so we're going to go to some exotic location and we're going to lock ourselves away for 3 days and keep everything secretive and then come out with, the answer like Moses coming down from the mountain with the 10 tablets of, the 10 commandments, and we wonder why it doesn't work.
Yeah, yeah.
So, we've really had to rethink our approach to, how we really set strategy and live strategy in these conditions of uncertainty.
Yeah. And you still see it, the classic offsite or the annual cadence of strategy development is very still prevalent in organizations, which gets frustrating as you try to get leaders to orientate more quickly. How do you increase this cadence? How do we make it a learning activity? They're doing a lot, but often I find, especially when you think about scenario thinking, is that it gets confused and leaders will look to the future and think, oh, the future's doing this and oh, that's great, and they sort of just stare at it and wait for it to come. Rather, how do we then take that insight, that learning, that discussion, and bring it to present to think about, okay, now we've sort of understood the multiple futures that we're faced with, how do we use that now today so that we can start making decisions and actions in the present?
Well, I guess the one thing that's always helpful to do is to be very clear about how you define your business and the business ecosystem in which you're operating, and to be very careful to understand the key uncertainties that you face in your environment. So the uncertainties might be around new technology, it might be about a change in regulatory features, it might be about new competitors entering the market, or it may actually be that your customer base is beginning to change. Now, I sort of liken uncertainties in your business environment almost like cracks in the surface
Mm.
of the land, if you like. And I mean, sometimes when you see a crack in the earth's layer, what it really suggests is that there's some fundamental flaw in the underlying system. And so in a way, what we often do is we often say that you should allow uncertainty to be your friend. And it's your
Mm.
friend for a number of reasons. One is that it really does signal the potential pathways into the future. So if you understand the uncertainties that you have at the moment, things that, you wish you knew more about so you could plan more clearly for the future. If you use those uncertainties and use them to really explore how they might lead to alternative futures, what that does then is gives you some understanding of what the probable futures might be. And you can build models from this. In fact, one of the methods we use in scenario thinking is to isolate your what I call critical uncertainties, which are the few uncertainties that have the biggest impact, that would have the biggest
Yeah.
impact on changing the game, and also which you are most uncertain about. Now, that in itself is kind of interesting because people are saying, well, we're very certain about this thing and therefore we should act on it. Well, yes, you should, but that's not the subject of scenario thinking. Scenario thinking is the stuff you're uncertain about, and that will have a big impact if they do eventuate. And those are the things you really need to take account of because they will shape the future. And once you've done that, you get a picture of these alternative futures. And the question then that we often find very interesting is we ask people not what is your strategy in that environment going to be in that probable future, and there's several, not what your strategy will be, but rather what capabilities will you need in order to survive, because you can't predict the strategy you're going to require until you've actually engaged with that environment. So you ask yourself, what are the capabilities I'll need to really do well under that set of conditions? And that's ultimately what resilience is about, having the right capabilities. And if you've got a range of very divergent futures, alternative futures, you then backcast from the futures into the present. Now, the question is, when you look at the capabilities across those different futures, how do you know which ones to really start preparing with and start building? And what we find is that when we backcast from these futures to the present and compare these different capabilities from these different futures, we find there's a series of commonalities. And we call those common capabilities low regret bets. In other words, these are things you can really invest in with a lower risk. And so these become, if you like, a sort of a no-brainer. Well, let's start preparing these common capabilities because we know we're going to require them under a range of different conditions. And as we kind of make our way towards these garden gates, it becomes clearer and clearer which one is beginning to materialize. And so if we continue the orientate and decide and act sort of loop, the OODA loop all the time, it really means we begin fine-tuning our approach as we get closer. And in a funny kind of way, it's kind of how they land on the moon. They start off saying, well, we think the moon's sort of there. Let's head off in that direction. And as long as you're heading in vaguely the right direction, what you're doing is you're orientating continuously as you get closer and closer and closer, fine-tuning the capabilities you'll require, and then actually finding that that is a way of really being prepared for that future that you've projected or you're looking towards being prepared for.
And I like that. And it really gets to the heart of how people prepare, because even though under those multiple futures, there's stuff that you currently have that probably will be consistent over those. And I think by looking at those, these elements aren't changing. These are the common capabilities that we're going to need that we don't currently have. So we can start investing in those. These ones we're not unsure about, but we can start to make, what do we need to see to enable us to figure out which path this start to go down. And you can start getting your team a bit more focused and orientated around those.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the interesting thing is that what I've observed is that those organizations who do some form of scenario plan will then choose what they see as the most likely plan or the most likely future. And I'm a little uncomfortable with that approach because, in a sense, if you're going to actually make a bet on what the future is going to be or which of those futures you're going to kind of prepare for, then you may as well have done that right in the beginning and don't worry about scenario planning at all. So I like to keep all those options open. And really, one of the key things in strategy, of course, in uncertainty is don't take too many actions that limit your future options. So you try to keep your options open, and common capabilities is a way of being able to do that. Now, I think often you find that this might mean there's a slight additional expense in the way you allocate your resources because maybe you're spreading your allocation a little more broadly than you'd otherwise like to. And sometimes you need to carry that additional expense. It's a kind of an anti-fragile measure, if you will. And there's always a cost in some kind of redundancy in any system. But I liken the additional cost of the small redundancy as being similar to business continuity insurance that you would have to pay anyway. So you start with your common capabilities, and you can begin paring them down as the picture begins to emerge and gets clearer and clearer. And sure, some of them might be redundant, some of them may not be needed any longer, but some of them may well need to be enhanced and built quite considerably to enable you to be effective in that situation.
And it's a lot easier or quicker to stop something rather than to try and rebuild something from scratch. Especially, and I like what you talked about the anti-fragile and that bit of redundancy. I get really frustrated with this common orthodoxy about efficiency, where it's like, oh, we must be efficient. And I always say, what question are you asking? You're asking, how do we be more efficient, or how do we make efficiencies? And often it's the latter. They're trying to make efficiencies, so they cut everything.
Yes.
And then they limit their options, like you said. Must always act in a way to increase your options. And they limit their options, and they limit their ability to have a bit of agility under these different scenarios as they start to come along. It's a frustration of mine.
It's really quite interesting, because one of the things I'll challenge the leadership team with is the statement that an efficient organization is very fragile. And that kind of shocks them a little. And we sort of go through that. An efficient system is one where the elements are very tightly coupled and there is no redundancy in any of them. And one of the things that cause it, well, there are two factors that cause the fragility there. The first is that because of the tight coupling, the ability to pivot or to change direction is in fact quite limited. The organization is really good at doing one thing and one thing really well, and if it encounters unanticipated environmental conditions, it can't shift. The other kind of weakness of a tightly coupled efficient system is that a problem in one area will actually cause the entire system to fail. So we talk about being very wary of over leveraging your key assets and having more than one pathway towards certain organizational outcomes. For example, if you find that this is a real example, that we encountered. If you find that the technical skills and the latest technical skills with the latest technology is very important for your people, then maybe you need to have more than one training department. And if you disperse geographically like we are in Australia, so this particular engineering business had a training centre in Perth in Western Australia and one in Melbourne on the East Coast. And obviously there was a duplication in certain cases where they could have saved by centralizing and standardizing everything on a shared service. The advantages were obvious, because oftentimes the one center would come up with something quite unique, and the discussion and the conversation between the two training centers often produced better solutions as a result of the diversity. Plus, of course, if one center fell over for whatever reason, there was always the other center. So I think this kind of redundancy that you need to carry is really a very powerful, but only in critical areas, of course. I mean, it's why your motor vehicle you drive has got more than one braking system. And the second braking system is probably never used, but it's always there in the event of an emergency.
Yeah, I like that analogy. And this comes at heart when we talk about alignment versus coherence.
Yes.
And people may think about its semantics, they're the same word, but they're not, because we're talking about coherence, exactly what you're saying, allows, self-organizing systems. They're not necessarily aligned, but they are working towards a viable system. But there's a bit of the decentralized, and they have ability to absorb adaptation quite quickly, where alignment often finds it means that they want everything the same. They want the core capabilities throughout the organization, and which often leads to a lot of centralization.
Yeah, I mean, I have a very personal story on this one. In fact, my doctoral research was really, which gave rise to a book, it was really about the alignment of strategy, culture, leadership, and the market. And in fact, in my work on strategic alignment, I argued very strongly about strong, high levels of alignment between the elements. And what I've increasingly begun to understand over the last sort of 10, 15 years is that the strict alignment actually increases the fragility of the organization. It may be capable of fitting very well. I mean, the whole concept of strategic fit, it may be capable of fitting to one set of environmental conditions, but not to adapt as the environment adapts. And of course, if the organization faces multiple parts of its environment as well, those parts can't adapt quite as freely. So, I think the argument about coherence and high levels of adaptation close to the customer or close to the interface with the environment is particularly important. So yeah, that's
Yeah,
a
yeah.
massive insight that I've actually had in the last sort of 10 years. And so people still want to buy my book, and I always have to sort of issue a cautionary tale about strategic alignment can actually go wrong as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, but I think that's the thing. This thinking moves on quite quick. I look at even in the short time since I left the army, my thinking's adapted, um, you know, immensely since I started. But I think it's that willingness of leaders and us consultants and researchers to constantly be open, have humility for new ideas, and to reorientate quite quickly. Which this is probably my bugbear with strategy. It hasn't really moved on. We're still using these typologies, and I don't really think that it's really lasted. There's a lot of useful stuff. I'm not saying that it's all rubbish, of course it's not, but there's a lot of useful stuff there. But I don't think many people are really open to an alternative conversation about how we develop and execute strategy.
Yeah, what do they say, Mike? That every general fights like the last battle he was in, of however long ago it might have been. Yeah, it's quite
Yeah, yeah,
interesting. And I mean, there's a lot of interesting things around that in the work that von Clausewitz did when he observed Napoleon as well. But I think your comment about sort of leadership and the almost static view that they develop. I mean, I'm a great fan of Adam Grant
yeah.
and his view that wisdom is the ability to change your mind when new evidence presents itself. And I think obviously the challenge here is ego.
Mm,
And it's quite interesting, in my work in Asia, for example, with this concern about face. If I change my mind, I'm seeing as admitting that I've made a mistake or I'm showing weakness. And I'm not saying it's confined there, but the thing that really helped me get a grip on this, at least in Asia, was that the face thing was openly spoken about and openly kind of manifested. And so being open and not under the surface, as I often find in sort of, and I'm going to call them more mature strategy systems like we have in Australia, in the UK, and the US, for example, in Western society, this thing is embedded deeply
mm.
in the form of ego. And that's much harder for people to kind of say, well, actually, there's nothing wrong in saying, I don't know the answers. And there's nothing wrong in saying, maybe you've got a better idea than me. And there's nothing wrong in saying, let's get my people involved, and more heads are better than one. And that's surprisingly why I've had a lot more success in these Asian countries actually using scenario thinking, because we can deal with the face issue because it's actually visible and known and spoken about, and we can deal with it. And yes, I have a face problem, people will say, maybe not in those terms, but you can then deal with it. So, and I think that, I'm starting to learn a lot of lessons about different ways of strategy conversations occurring and the sort of way in which they can take place at multiple points in the organization, and really, the coalescing that takes place in a very dynamic and organic way, which produces the real answers, and quickly too, often.
Yeah, yeah, that's really good point around ego, and we see it. And I'm going to come back to that point about coalescing with multiple levels. But I don't know what it's like in Australia, but in British politics, there's a lot of moment around flip-flopping and U-turns of
Mm.
decisions and stuff like this. I think that sort of permeates into organisations to think, oh, I've made a decision, so I must stick to it. Where there's a very distinct difference between having no coherence, i.e., you're just going into entropy or chaos because
Just
you
drifting
have
along,
no,
yeah.
yeah, you
Mm.
just drifted along.
Mm.
To, yes, it was our assumption, looking at what we were faced with, that these would be good decisions or good policies to go forward. But as new information came to us, we've now adapted. We've realised actually there's better options or alternative view, or that didn't work. And I think that's a distinction that needs
Mm.
to be made when people are looking at leaders, thinking, are they just flip flopping, or is it the fact that they're got humility, they're open to new ideas and new information as it's
And
presented?
feedback as well.
Yeah,
Look,
feedback. Yeah,
you opened the Pandora's box when you asked me what it's like in Australia. I think we have a very serious problem in Australia with the same issue. I mean, we have a government at the moment that is ideologically committed to a certain form of energy production, which is by and large renewable,
Mm,
which all the evidence suggests is not necessarily very sustainable if there isn't a very solid baseload provision of power. And we just ideologically refuse to consider nuclear, even though, left-leaning governments around the world have embraced it. And
mm,
so in thinking about that, I think there's an interesting issue here about the fear of doing a U-turn or the fear of changing directions. And I think we're wedded to what I like to call Cartesian logic, this
yeah.
French philosopher that developed this notion in the 1500s where things are in very much binary. They're either right or wrong, and it's either left or right or one or zero or black or white. And so there's a sense that if you're not doing what you say you were going to do and change, then you're wrong. And Cartesian logic doesn't really have space for, I suppose, what you might call fuzzy logic. And I often use this example. I say, my missus loves and hates me. My children are good and bad. And both those possibilities exist at the same time. And that kind of
Yeah.
possibility thinking is really what you need, where we see new evidence emerging. We say, gee, there's a possibility that this might work rather than what we're doing at the moment. And we're not sort of blowing our whole binary system apart by changing our view and in the face of new evidence. We are simply adjusting and adapting in a kind of an organic biological way to changes in conditions. So I mean, I think that I find that getting back to scenarios again, I find that one of the things that is a very strong psychological advantage of using scenarios is it allows people to explore these alternative views of the world, which is so different from the world they're living in at the moment, in a safe way. They don't actually have to admit, gee, they've been wrong all along. They're just saying these are possibilities. And then the question is, what would you do if you faced yourself in that possibility? And, and now you can use your logic and say, well, logically, what are the capabilities I might need in that environment? And then secondly, what are the capabilities I might need in the second or third or fourth environment? And so, in a sense, you break down that Cartesian binary way of looking at things, but in a gentle way, which doesn't bother the ego too much.
Yeah.
And so, I find that the biggest difficulty I have in getting a scenario project underway is getting the chief executive to agree that a lot of other people, very diverse set of people, are going to be, and some of them really close to the customer, junior, going to be involved in developing the scenarios because they've got, very alternative views, controversial views of what the future might hold.
Yeah.
So, I think you're quite right. It's that fear of having to do a U-turn or having to be admitting that you were wrong, but it's not about right or wrong.
No. And we're often dealing with paradoxes or, duality. And I often laugh with people because even with that same logic, the logic is around good or, it's got to be amazing or not. And they're always looking for this perfect answer, and they're going, well, it must be perfect. Well, I always try and get my clients I work with to go, no, we're not looking for the perfect answer. We're looking for the least worst.
The optimal.
To get, the least worst, the one that's like, out of all these things we're looking at, these possibilities, there's never going to be a perfect solution that's going to solve all our problems. I wish then life would be a lot easier, but it's not, unfortunately. And there has to be this, what I call strategic ambiguity.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's the price you pay for living in a complex environment. That there is no best practice or right or wrong. It's just the one that does kind of seem to cause the least harm, and that all the stakeholders are equally prepared to kind of have a bit of their preferences kind of avoided, kind of thing. So it's very interesting, how you do that, and the ability for a senior leader to kind of accept that, I think is key to the whole thing, and the senior team to accept that as well is pretty key as well.
Yeah. I think the key to understand that there are going to be things that they dislike, and try to not get them so focused on the things that they dislike, and look at it more objectively around, You know, what are the limitations of this approach? What are the strengths? And if there's limitations, then what are we doing to make sure that we can coordinate that or minimize its impact on what we're doing, rather than just focusing. What I often see, they just focus and go, well, it's just bad, so it's just impossible. It's not impossible, but we need to do something to minimize it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we saw that in the array of solutions that were used during COVID.
Mm.
And you can't argue that any of them was right or wrong. They just were the ones that seemed to suit the circumstances in which they were in. And I sort of laugh when people talk about that as being a black swan, because I think we actually knew that
Mm.
an airborne respiratory disease was one of the possibilities, and we just did nothing to prepare for it. We didn't ask
Yeah,
ourselves what
yeah, yeah,
capability would we need in that set of conditions.
yeah.
So
And yeah, and it's not like it hadn't happened before.
no, I mean SARS was a classic example. I mean, I
Yeah.
remember we did an exercise for a multinational hotel group in Southeast Asia, and the question was asked, "What happens if there's a war in Southeast Asia?" And everyone laughed, and they said, "Nah, that'll never happen." But we began to explore what that might mean for the hotel business that really thrived on people traveling a lot and business people traveling. And it was one of the scenarios, although it was kind of laughed at. But of course, when SARS occurred, they knew this was the exact set of conditions. And, there were a lot of very innovative approaches which they'd already kind of been thinking and working through and they'd built capabilities for. So, there's some real examples where that kind of thinking will actually work and produce really powerful results.
I think that's the key when we talk about, I said earlier around the plan is nothing, the planning is everything.
Hmm.
It's this opportunity for that thinking, that space to actually be strategic. I rarely see a lot of strategic leaders, executives, they spend a vast amount of their time on balanced scorecards that tell me what happened last month. Rarely is that thinking around, well, what if this happens? That really that thinking, because the reason why the planning is
Yeah.
everything is because, like you said, we were talking about war, but SARS happened, but there was a lot of commonalities that
Mm.
enable them to shift rapidly. And because it's not new thinking, it's just like that similar, we can make the constructs in our mind quite easily and adapt, which I love that story. That's great.
Yeah, I mean that was a real example, and it sort of taught me a lot as well. About persevering with possibilities, and incidentally, that's one of the reasons that we like to keep the senior executives a little at arm's length in the initial stages of constructing these alternative scenarios, because most of them struggle with a scenario in which their core skills aren't still, the dominant ones.
Yeah, yeah,
In fact, it's like sometimes, one of the scenarios is that the aeroplane that they were flying kind of disappears in the Bermuda Triangle and is never seen again. And somehow they manage to spirit themselves back into life and they take the organization back. So strong is this desire to project the future as simply a continuation of what the past has been. So it's very interesting.
yeah, yeah. And I like that because earlier you mentioned the word viable, keeping the organization viable. And that's a term I like, and fit, because when we're thinking about multiple futures, you've got to be open to the possibility that you may not be continuing what you've always done, but you're adapting to be viable in the new world, the new context.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting frame to get leaders to think about viability. Viability doesn't mean doing exactly the same thing. There'll be a lot of commonalities, but it's how do you continually create fit in that external environment?
Yeah, and if the environment is continuously changing, then part of the solution has to be in letting go and decentralizing, creating multiple nodes of decision making. I often talk about there's the core strategy, but
Mm.
then there are which is kind of like the default mode, but then there's many overlays which you need to be prepared to as well, for as well. Where if this happens, well then we are given greater degrees of freedom to really make a decision that meets the demands of that situation.
Yeah, yeah.
And that just means again coherence becomes important. And
Mm.
it's interesting, one of the kind of lessons I did retain from my work in strategic alignment is that culture isn't the unifying factor in an organization. A lot of
Yeah.
leaders will talk to you and say, we want to build a strong culture. We want one culture. And even today, we see some of these large multinationals, and they've got a culture charter, and it's kind of a one size fits all. And you will achieve alignment, but you'll never achieve coherence and adaptability in that situation. I tell them it's not culture that'll serve as the glue. It's purpose and an understanding that we have a range of things that we'll have to do, and any of them may occur at any point in time, depending on what the variations in the environment are. So coherence is actually much harder to develop than it is alignment. And it's very interesting. I was just reading a very old piece of work by Clayton Christensen.
Oh yeah.
And he made a comment. He said 100% is much easier than 95%. And he was referring to a personal habit. He was saying, if I've got a habit, or if I've got a thing that says I've got to go for a 5 kilometer run every morning, come rain or hail or snow or whatever, it's much easier to stick to that every morning. You just get up, you have to do that. But if I kind of say, well, yes, there are exceptions, that's a lot harder because you've got to make many more decisions. So in a sense, alignment is a lazy way. It's kind of like cognitive offloading, where you say, well, we don't have to think about this because everyone's going to operate in the same way all the time. But as soon as you need to start looking at situations which vary and change and making decisions, this kind of orientation process, which is quite cognitively taxing, has to occur, and has to occur at more places than one in the organization. So
Yeah,
yeah, I
yeah.
mean, it's a good argument.
And I've seen that recently with an organisation that are very aligned. But the thing is, when things start to change or need any adaptations, they have to adapt it across the whole organisation,
Yeah,
the way
right.
that they structure themselves, rather than if they had designed themselves for coherence or adaptability, where they made decentralized elements that have all the resources and capabilities to be able to achieve the outcomes and a fit that they need for their part of the environment.
Yeah.
Then when there's an adaptation, they need to adapt that part.
That's exactly right. And
Yeah.
the funny thing is, though, that when the organisation is tightly aligned and has to go through a massive restructure or realignment in order to cope with new conditions in the market, you get the IKEA effect occurring, where they put so much effort into the realignment, into the restructure, they then remain so committed to that they become almost impervious to further change. So in a
Yeah,
way,
yeah.
it just kind of snowballs. It gets worse and worse.
And this is where I think people get confused with like grand strategy and strategy, in a sense that, a bit like you talked a bit earlier, some things don't change. Like if I'm a if I'm a rail provider, I provide, trains to move. That's probably not going to change. If I sell biscuits, that's what we've done, then that's not really going to change. We can have that coherence. What will change is how preferences, I suppose, with customers, definitely the biscuit story, and we can adapt things there at the certain local levels. But I think people, when they come to look at transformations or the annual strategic offsite, it's almost as if they're trying to reevaluate or rediscover or create a repurpose. That was what you're talking about, purpose. Yeah,
Yes,
trying to find a new
the new
purpose every year. And I'm thinking, well, no, your purpose is there. Your purpose is to run the infrastructure, or your purpose is this. But they seem to try and change it every year, which I think causes massive confusion with people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you've defined your purpose clearly, then I think you're quite comfortable with a wide array of alternative scenarios, because you know that I mean, your purpose is what ensures the coherence. The adaptability can occur within that coherence as well.
Mm.
And it's one of the reasons that I've discovered, for example, that again in Asia, the with which organizations have adapted to changes in the technological environment, and the effectiveness of their sort of execution of the adaptation and the changes they've made has just been phenomenal, because their purpose is so clear, but
Mm.
their understanding of how they need to go about that is very much dependent on what's the evidence we have in front of us at the moment, and as that changes, so they change as well.
Yeah, yeah.
I think, in a way, scenario thinking, look, I mean, it's not the only way to deal with uncertainty, but I do think that this idea of we face multiple futures sort of continuously reminds you that the environment's changing, and that in order for us to remain viable, and relevant, we need to make sure that we have the capabilities across a wide array of environments to survive. And that's ultimately what resilience is. It's not just about being stronger. It's actually about being adaptable and learning from the changes you make.
Yeah, and it's like the idea of wind tunneling, over those
Yep.
scenarios. How does my organisation fare under those? What's falling apart and a bit shaky, and what's
Yeah.
solid and can work? And I think that's a good sort of analogy to think about your organisation in those situations. But yeah, I think again it has to have that strong coherence because, as we said, if people are constantly flip flopping, a bit of chaos, and they're not really consistent with they are. It's even down to, you see, when we talked about culture, you'll get people go, oh, we need a new culture. So we've got these new values, and they'll throw values out like it's, like a once in every year activity, and thinking, I've really challenged that, if you really understood your organization and what you needed to emerge from that organization at the start, again, with purpose, I really struggle to think that your behaviors or values or whatever need to change that much. It should be quite solid. And if they are needing to change, then I probably are challenged the fact that you're not, you haven't got the structure, you've got leaders that are accepting stuff that probably they shouldn't be.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the values thing is, it's a bit of a cruel thing, but if I'm in a forum with different groups of people, different individuals from different organizations, I'll just say to someone, I don't know who you are or what your business is, but I'll tell you what, I can probably get at least 5 out of 6 of your core values. And I'll say customer centricity, innovation, collaboration, teamwork, and they just, as you say, and the reality is, though, those values should really describe the purpose of the organization.
Yes.
And therefore they are the bedrock of the strategy in some ways. It's very interesting because one of the things that we're kind of looking at the moment is who should really steer or who should have ownership of the strategy process in the organization, not the content but the
Mm,
process. And I think there seems to be an argument to be made for the people that look after organization development are probably those that really should be doing that, because I think there's a strong understanding of the values or the values that they need, and there's a recognition that the strategy really needs to be faithful to that, because if they've done the values exercise correctly, which in turn has meant that they've got the purpose correct, the whole thing should remain coherent as a result of that. So
yeah.
early days, but we're seeing some interesting progress there.
I think you're right, especially with, the OD world, with the fact that they are the ones that will ensure the training of especially new capabilities. You
Yeah.
want them tightly coupled with the strategy development, because as soon as they start to pull apart and they start to do stuff that's not coherent with it, you're going to have all sorts of
Oh,
wasted
God, yes.
opportunities. You see this though, because I look at organizations, they tell me this is their strategy, and I can argue that's strategy or not, but then I go, okay, then, so what else you've got? And they go, oh, I'll go down the organization. They go, oh, we've got a HR strategy. We've got an OD
Yes.
strategy. We've got this strategy. And I'm like, Jesus. And I look at them and, I could be pedantic and say, well, it's not a strategy because you've got a strategy and that's a plan rather than a strategy. But um, I look at them and think they are not aligned. This does not in any way, shape, or form show me how you're enabling this to happen. Actually, a lot of the times they're conflicting.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you, I bristle when they talk about an HR strategy, a technology strategy, because I'd argue that there's only the business strategy and then the functions which have to support that strategy. And what they're really doing is enabling the strategy and supporting the strategy or making the strategy work. And
Mm.
and just on the on the HR area, my worst is where they'll go out and they'll do a skills audit and find, oh, we have a lot of we have a big shortage in teamwork. We need to build teamwork, and yet when you look at the organisation, it's one that really is based on individual accountability and individual autonomy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
just nonsensical. So yeah, the coherence there as well. I'll stop using the word alignment as well, because I think you've alerted me, and it's probably crystallized some of my thinking, which has been a bit slower than yours. But yeah, it's good.
I love having these conversations. And the reason why I started this podcast is to find an alternative perspectives so we can have this really challenge and discussion. That's why I prefer it
Yeah.
more of a discussion. But you're right, and I recently just wrote this week about seeing before aspiration, and what I meant by that was exactly what you said. It's that let's not think like in that scenario with the HR, they are just going off the typical tropes that they think they
Mm,
need because
mm,
it sounds nice and it's what
mm,
loads of people are saying, oh, we need more teamwork,
mm.
rather than going, actually, what is our organization for? And then what do we need then to emerge? And if it's not teamwork, because we don't need teamwork, then that's fine. It's
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
it's it's fine. And then once you have that really good understanding of what your organization's there for, what does it emerge, what's its actual capabilities, not what you think it is, that's when it then aspiration comes really good and futures. Because I would question a lot of times when people are looking at multiple scenarios, the futures, they really actually understand what their organization's capable. And then when you're transferring that into, right, these are the multiple futures, let's think today, what actions do we need to make? What
Yeah.
capabilities do we have? I wonder if there's a bit of dissonance there in that process.
Yeah. I mean, I think it sort of brings to mind, the L. Michael Porter comment about trade-offs, and trade-offs are your
Mm.
friend. Maybe teamwork is not what we need here. Maybe what we need is what was the term that was used? I just can't get my head around. But there was a term that I used to use where I described the difference between a cricket team and a rugby team. I said a rugby team, each player, although they have a role, the team has to work in unison. Whereas in
Mm.
cricket, each individual has got a specific role that stands or falls irrespective of what everyone else is doing. The wicket keeper, the fast bowler, the spinner, the opening bat, and so on. And what did I talk? I said there was teamwork, and then there was collaborative individualism. That's right. So
Oh
there's a
yeah, that's good. Yeah, yeah,
there's a,
yeah.
there's a big spectrum there, and I think when we talk about teamwork, you may be destroying the very thing that your organization thrives on.
It's the same with teams across the organization because they're saying, oh, this team needs to have to get called in for working better together type thing. And I'm
Mm.
like, it's not working better together. Like, to be honest, I don't really care if this team has empathy for that team or can see objectively understand what they're going through. What I want to know is what do they need to coordinate about, how often, and by what means? And is that is
Yeah.
that working? Yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
What's
I
the
don't care if they,
interdependence between those teams
yeah,
then?
yeah, yeah, yeah. But it gets always gets stuck on that emotional level that we've got to really have empathy for each other across the piece. And no, I just, the humans they will have, but I don't want them to, in detail, really understand from their perspective everything that they need to do because they haven't got the cognitive capacity. I just want them to focus on what they need to do, but then the coordination between the two.
Sometimes there's this view that too much communication or too much sharing can actually be bad as well. And
Yeah,
often you
yeah.
find when you've got to tell everybody what you're doing all the time, it just doesn't make sense. Yeah,
No.
very good.
No, I like it. That's what I love these conversations and the opportunity to have you on was fantastic. Just to have a chat really because we communicate a lot over
Social
social media.
media,
Yeah,
yeah.
but it's good to just have a conversation. I've really enjoyed it. But
Thanks,
for
Mike.
our
Yeah, it was good.
listeners, what would you like to leave our listeners with to think about from this podcast?
I think that the kind of core idea here for me has been that we need to accept that, there is uncertainty in our environment and they do cause multiple futures to emerge. The kind of need to be aware of what capabilities are required in those multiple futures and to focus on the common ones really means that you are ensuring that you've built in adaptability in your organization and to stop trying to predict the future, but to recognize that the future will emerge as you engage with it. And you need to be continuously learning from your engagement and changing your view about what's the right thing to be done at this point in time. So that's pretty much it.
I like it, and I think the whole conversation has really got to the heart of a really pragmatic view of what futures is and how we as leaders can orientate through that. But thank you very much, Norm. Um, and if you like the episode, please like, share across your network so others can get the value that Norm shared today and help us, grow and really challenge how we can make strategy meet reality. Again, thank you so much for joining me, Norm. It's a great pleasure.
Thanks, Mike. It was great to talk to you again tonight, and good luck with all of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.